So today we're going to look at how we can recognize equations of circles, especially when they're not in our standard form. We are first going to do a quick review on how we complete the square. So very first thing you want to do is you want to see if the leading coefficient is 1. If not, we're going to divide each term by the leading coefficient. So if we look at this equation, this example over here, I can see the leading coefficient is 1. So we don't have to do any division. The second thing we're going to do is if there is a constant term on the left side of the equation, then we're going to move the constant term to the right side. Or in other words, I want to take this constant that I see here and I want to move it to the other side so that it's separate from the terms that have an x involved. So in this case, I would have to add the 2 over. So now it's on the opposite side of that equal sign. Okay, the third thing we're going to do is set up the problem to receive the addition of the value, which will create a perfect square trinomial on the left side. Inserting boxes may help remind you to add the value. So what I like to do, if I don't write a box in there, kind of like I did up above, is I will leave a space and I'll put an equal sign and another space. Now, it may be helpful until we're really good at this and we remember how to complete the square to fill in those boxes. Okay, so in order to complete the square, we need to get a value for that perfect square trinomial. And the process we're going to do is we're going to take half of the coefficient of the middle term, that x term, and we're going to square it. Once we do this, we're going to add that value to both sides of the equation. Okay, so we're going to see what happens. So it says take half of the coefficient of the middle term. So like we have down below, that's that 4. So if I were to take half of 4, we're going to get a value of 2. And it's a positive 2, watch your signs. And then we're going to take that positive 2 and we're going to square it, which will give us a 4. Now it says we're going to put that value in the boxes. In other words, we're going to add that value to both sides. And again, I want to be careful with my signs. If it was negative, I'd have to take into account that negative sign. Okay, so right now I have something that looks like x squared plus 4x plus 4. And on this side I have 2 plus 4. So notice that we've balanced the equation. Okay, if we were to continue with this, it says now we're going to factor the perfect square trinomial on the left-hand side. Well, if we were to factor this, this is saying I need something that's going to multiply to be my middle term and add to be my last term. So something that's going to multiply to be my middle term and add to be my last term would look like a 2. Okay. And on the other side I have a 6. Now I could rewrite this rather than having to write x plus 2, x plus 2. It's the same thing as saying x plus 2 quantity squared. And so now we have just transformed this quadratic equation by completing the square. So this is what we're going to be doing as we are trying to identify different equations for circles. We have to use this completing the square process. And one little nice hint is whenever we're trying to complete the square, or I should say make this factor down here, you're going to notice that this number, this 2, is always whatever half of our middle term was. So back up here we saw it was a positive 2. Notice that that factor is also a positive 2. We're going to keep that in mind as we continue through. So let's try another example. So again, we're going to use completing the square to transform that following equation. So our first step was to take a look and see what our coefficient in the x squared term was, and it's 1, so we don't have to divide anything through. The second step was to take that constant and we're going to move it to the other side of the equation. So I have to think add 4 to both sides of the equation. Then we said let's put a little space holder in here so that we remember I have to add something to both sides. Okay, and so now our process. We're going to take the coefficient of our x term. We're going to take that, divide it. We want to take half of that middle term. So half of our middle term we get a positive 4. We take the positive 4, we square positive 4, which gives us 16. So that 16 now we get to add to both sides. And at this point, we're going to write our factors. So now, like we did up above, I need something that's going to multiply to be 16, but add to be 8. And our quick trick we said was, well, whatever half of our middle term was, would be that repeated factor that we're looking for. So if I think x plus 4 times x plus 4, and I use my double distribution or my FOIL technique, I would realize if I FOILed it, that would bring me right back up to here. So to simplify this, we're just going to write this as x plus 4 quantity squared equals 20. So again, we have used completing the square to transform this function. Okay, so if we look on the back, we have two different forms of the equations of the circles. One we saw in our previous lesson, which was our standard form. The general form is more of the one that we're going to be taking a look at today. So completing the square will help us with this. So this says the following equation of a circle is a radius of 5 and a center of 1, 2. We're going to use that technique that we just did on the front of the page to prove that. So notice now we have two terms that are squared. We have the x terms, we have the y terms. So we're going to do that same process that we did on the front of the page, just 2 times. First thing I would do is let's make sure that we have all our x terms together. I'm going to leave a little space. Make sure I have all of my y terms together. I'm going to leave a little space. And I have my constant. Now remember, we said anything that was a constant needs to go to the other side of the equation. So that means I'm going to subtract over a 1. I'm going to subtract over a 4. Okay? So over here I would have 25 minus 1 minus 4. Okay. Now we're going to do that completing the square process that we did up on the front page, but we're going to do it twice. One for the x terms. We're going to do it one for the y terms. So what we need now, like we had filled in before, we had a placeholder. So I need a placeholder for the x's, and I need a placeholder for the y's. Okay, so we're going to start. We find our middle term, and this time our middle term is a -2, watching the sign. Half of our middle term is a -1. We take that -1 and square it, which becomes a +1. So that +1 is what we're going to put into our placeholders. On the other side, for the y values, we do the same thing. It's just now I have a -4. So I'm going to do this on the right side of the page. So I have a -4. It's the coefficient. I take half, which gives me a -2. And I take that -2 and now I square a -2 and that becomes +4. So notice what happens now is we're going to add that +4 in both places in both of our placeholders. Okay, now we're going to make our factor. We said our quick trick for the middle factor is whatever half of that middle term was will become our factor. So half of our middle term was a -1. So watching that sign, I get a -1 squared. Do the same thing for the y's. Half of our middle term for the y value was a -2. So now I have y minus 2 quantity squared. Now I'm going to just simplify the right side. So I have 25 minus 1 minus 4 plus 1 plus 4 gives us 25. So it said we wanted to show that it had a center of 1, 2. Well, if we go back to our standard form that we learned before, we can find our center coordinates here. So I can see our center is, in fact, at 1, 2. That was h, k. And this 25 we know is equal to our radius squared. So that means your radius must equal 5. I would have to take the square root of 25, and that would leave me with a radius of 5. Okay, we're going to try one more problem, same idea. So this time we want to find the center in the radius. So again, we're going to have to transform it. So first thing, I want to make sure I have my x's gathered, maybe a little space. Make sure I have my y's gathered, leave a little space, and I have my constants. Now we don't have any other constants to move this time. So we're just going to start with that completing the square process, keeping in mind I have a space that I need to fill in. And I have 2 spaces I need to fill in over here since we're completing the square twice. We look at our coefficient, I see it's 4. Take half of 4, which is a 2. I take that 2, square it, which becomes a 4, and I add that to both sides. We do the same thing now with our y's. So our y's, we have a negative 12, and again, watch your signs. So we have a negative 12 divided by 2 is a negative 6. We take that negative 6 and square it, and that becomes a positive 36. So again, I'm going to add 36 to both sides. And now we make our factors. Quick trick, whatever half of the middle term was becomes the factor. So that tells me it's got to be x plus 2 squared. Do that again for the y's. Half of our middle term was negative 6. So now we have y minus 6 squared. And then when we simplify, 41 plus 4 plus 36, we get 81. Now again, we need to find the center and the radius. So our center, that's our h and k values. So we can say here our center is at the location negative 2, positive 6, and the radius, keep in mind 81 is really equal to r squared. So if I want just r, I have to square root that, and our radius is going to be 9. I hope this helped. On the bottom there are some pictures of how perhaps your calculator can help you as well. Maybe keystrokes if we need to get there. You want to be in a graph window. Once you're in that graph window on your Inspire, you're going to press the menu button. Then you're going to press the number 3. That's going to bring you up to Graph Entry Edit. Then you're going to press again the number 3, which is your equation templates. And then you press the number 3 one more time, which is for circles. And notice they give you the 2 forms. So they tell you here's your center form and here's your standard form. Hope this helped. Don't forget to like and subscribe.